Liz.
And I'm Marie, and this is Mock It, a podcast with MetroStar where we take a deep dive into UX design, trending design topics, and making our work transform the government. Let's get started.
So today, Marie and I have a super fun guest, Logan House. He is actually one of our UX architects on the project with us. So hi, Logan. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hello, I'm so happy to be here. This is so much fun.
So today we're going to be talking about how to lead remote research with stakeholders, and you've definitely been one of our subject matter experts on our project, and so we are just really grateful that you're here with us. So with that, if you want to take a minute or two to introduce yourself and let the listeners know who you are and what you do.
Hello, yeah, my name's Logan House. I am a UX architect, I guess is my title. But basically I'm part of the design team. I'm on the same project with Liz and Marie. So we work together every day. And now even on my PTO, I'm still volunteering to hang out. But yeah, I've been on the same project for I think nearly 2 years, or maybe a little bit past 2 years. So yeah, we've been most of this project's been remote, so that's definitely a topic that we have a lot of experience in at this point.
Yeah, and so for listeners, can you tell us what user research is and why it's important to our project, but any project?
I think a lot of times, UX is one of those fields that it's so new that sometimes there's not even a consistent titles to it. So a lot of times I feel like at MetroStar, there's a really big emphasis on design, but outside of that people can kind of get confused. But UX is the two important halves of there is the design end on the later half, but it has to be buttressed from this foundational user research. And it's if you don't do research, it's just UI, which is half of it. UX is the research into this cool creative design work. So user research is basically the foundation to what we do as UX designers, where before you even put pen to paper for anything, you need to understand what the problem is you're solving for. So you're talking to people, you're having very open-ended conversations, you are gathering information before you begin to funnel into what is our problem, what are we solving for, and then gathering more information before we even begin to conceptualize what a solution would be. So user research has a lot of different forms. It can be a big foundational one is the user interview, because it's just hey, I don't know anything, let's just talk and figure out what's happening. But then there's also more specific things depending on what you're looking for. If you're usability testing an existing product to solution, things that are working or things that aren't, there's they really run the gambit of surveys and architecture testing, which we've done a lot of. But yeah, it's basically just that kind of foundational fact finding that happens before you really begin to solution anything from a UX perspective.
I'm gonna put you on the spot one more time about definitions, just because I know as we get more into it, and since all of us work on the same project, there's going to be some differentiators among these. So you just gave an overview of what user research is. Would you care to tell people what stakeholder research is and what customer research is, and potentially the difference between those two?
Yeah, it's there's the perfect world, and then there's the world that we live in, which is and always a rough thing. But it's that there's UX best practice that is the foundation of what you should be doing. It's that kind of scientific research minded way to find solutions and to solve problems. But the part of UX is not just doing the best thing, but it's understanding the limitations that you have and doing the best work you can within the reality of what time frame you're working in. Because we're not academic researchers in the sense that we don't have unlimited time. Developers are hey, give us something. You're okay, well, let's do our best here. And so user research, to customer research, that is when you are speaking to the direct users of the product, someone who is utilizing this or buying something. They're the actual people who are utilizing it. We live kind of in a world where we have to work within the limitations that we have, and that can be a limitation of time, it can be a limitation of resources, and it can be a limitation of access. And as people who are working on government contracts, there are important regulations that are really critical to how the government operates, but sometimes can have a little friction about how sometimes UX has sort of begun to operate in kind of typically like a private setting, like a private industry setting, I mean. And some of those things, like, the Paperwork Reduction Act, for example, creates certain challenges in terms of access to users. There's a lot of interesting things you can do in terms of like looking into these laws and regulations themselves to try to figure out the best space to argue in terms of still operating within the regulation, but understanding like that, that there is a value to what we're doing as UX designers. I think specifically in the Paperwork Reduction Act, I want to say that there are some bylines that it's like you can definitely sneak in some user research that it still is appropriate, because I think it has to do with the fact
there is, I don't remember the specific words, but there is certain research that you can get through, like no matter what, that doesn't apply to. And then there's also like a fast track if you need to get approval of like 45-ish days compared to like, I think the like full term is 90 or something it can take sometimes with surveys.
I think also part of it is like, if it is important for like public information, because the whole thing is transparency in government. But if you can argue that it's like, this is just internal, this is not a large enough sample size to be considered a long-term research study, then you can kind of finagle around that. But getting to the original point, it's like, with the reality like that we're living in these limitations, like stakeholders come in where it's not the perfect world, stakeholders being they're not the users, but the sort of the other actors in this system, who are like not maybe the direct users, but they're like the people who are employees of the government or other users of the system. And they can provide really valuable insight about how a problem is situated and what potential solutions could be. It's tricky because beautiful thing about UX is sometimes people can just say stuff. And that's why a sample size is really important. And that's why, you have to keep in mind that when you're talking to stakeholders, that they're not your users. It's buttressing information. It's like looking around the shadows of a problem to figure out like what the contour of the shape is. But at the same time, it's more inferencing than it is a direct evidence. So it's tricky. So we've done a lot of stakeholder research to get around the difficulty of not having direct user information, but there's limitations there for sure. But at the same time, it's valuable in terms of getting some kind of information to sort of fulfill our, curious needs.
Yeah, no, I do like totally agree with you. I think the stakeholder research, because I know some folks might be, that's what you can do, has been helpful for us to get a deeper understanding of our product, so that when we do get in front of our actual end users, right, we're more informed, we're more knowledgeable to ask better questions. I know we've all we've asked a question where we weren't quite sure about the topic and how to phrase it, or so then it got a little weird. I mean, we got through it, we worked through it with the user, but I think that stakeholder research helps inform us to be better, curious designers.
Definitely. And then again, so as we've talked about on this call or on this podcast and previous podcasts, all three of us are the UX team on our project. And when we went into quarantine in March of 2020, we were in the middle of doing our first major round of stakeholder research. And we had just done a few interviews, and then boom, we were told, all right, like, see you in 2 weeks, and now we're almost on 2 years.
Yeah.
So,
and it wasn't just like, boom, see you in 2 weeks. It was like, boom, you're doing user research tomorrow. Yeah. Figure it out virtually.
Yeah. So
it wasn't, there was a pause. We'll start back up in 2 weeks.
Yeah, that's a good disclaimer. Do you want to walk us through sort of the process of hosting remote user research or stakeholder research, and what does it look like? What tools do we use? And we can chime in as needed, since we're all in the same project. So.
Yeah, exactly. I know, it's like I could ask the questions to you guys as well, because we were all so in it together. But basically, we were in the beginning. I think we were partway through a quite a few stakeholder interviews when we were, shifted to remote, and that's honestly been most of my memories of this project until this point.
Yeah.
It's been so long. Um, but basically, I remember the big thing is we were doing user interviews. So that like user interviews or this is stakeholder interviews in the frame of what is typically understood as a user interview, but instead interviewing stakeholders. Um, for background like that is like these open-ended conversations where you kind of go in with like your facts beforehand, so you can begin to like go from very general to more specific questions, kind of like figuring out the world that we're living in, like what are potential user frustrations, problems, what is like the world of this project that we're living in before we can sort of formulate like a problem statement and move forward. But we were doing these very open-ended conversations. And a big thing about user interviews is you want to sort of like understand every aspect of communication, because you're talking to people and it's open-ended. But the cool thing about UX research is because it's people-based, it's like humanistic, it's not like a hard science in the sense of you're trying to empathize with a person, understand how they're feeling. And that means asking questions and listening to their responses, but also looking for like their nonverbal cues of like, where are they hesitating? Like you ask them a question and they say something with like very much confidence, or they say things with like very little confidence. There's like, and it's also about like this connection that you make with this person as you talk to them, because you want to build a rapport and make them feel comfortable. So that's something that's really great to do in person, because you can force a pause just to like create silence to pressure someone to fill it so they keep talking. And when we shifted to remote, and so we went from these in-person conversations to conversations over Zoom, of which we weren't doing with camera on, which I think in retrospect, I think maybe I've changed my opinion that maybe if we could, camera on user interviews would be better, maybe. But it's like the difference between like a FaceTime and a phone call. Like when there's silence on a phone call, it is just sometimes the most painful thing in my life. But if there's silence on a Zoom, you're still communicating like non-verbally. You're like looking them in the eye and you're still communicating silently. And so there's like a tricky thing about going these remote interviews where it's tricky because you have to really listen closely to what they're saying, in the sense of that is the only avenue of communication you're getting from them. And you have to like, it's tricky to have there be silence. It's definitely, it presented its own problems. And I'm very happy with the work that we did, for sure, especially like having to just like invent it as we go along. But it's interesting thinking back about like what I would do differently. But it was interesting. And I mean, actually, I believe in the work that we did, but I definitely wonder if maybe having camera on is like a really good solution moving forward. But I don't know. I'm not sure what you guys think.
I love your insightful retrospective right now. Not gonna lie, you have led the charge, especially since like March 2019, and I was like, all right, cool, teens got their footing. We've mentioned it in some other episodes, right? I took on more of being a Scrum leader for our team because total full confidence in you. My head is, let's do it the next time of interviews. You know me, yeah. I'm always up to try new things and iterate. Because and we can compare, right? Timing is different. So maybe people will just be more comfortable being virtual, or there's like, what's the fatigue impact going to be on virtual stuff? Let's try it on camera. And we can even do like a real study and do like 50% on camera, 50% off for 2 different sample sizes. We can go wild here.
And it's funny, you're like a little retro, because one of the questions that we're going to ask you was what were like your top 3 tips for leading a successful virtual exercise. So maybe that might be your first tip is have camera on.
But yeah, I know, and I apologize. I know sometimes I could just filibuster until we just hit our max time here. But I don't know. It's interesting, but we also, I mean, it wasn't just user interviews. There seemed to be a big architecture problem on this project that we were working on. The product that we were creating, it was really difficult to sort of navigate through it. And because I think there was a limitation in where the project was and where we approached it in terms of what they had time to do. And so that was like a really big thing, is so we like did these open-ended interviews, But we also did this very specific test as well called card sorting, excuse me, which is like this cool kind of like kind of thought experiment where you like take units of any kind of organization and basically put them with cards. It could be like fruits or like I don't know, like sports things, and you organize them under certain headers. But yeah, so basically it's like taking things that could be organized and asking users what is the natural organization to what they kind of innately find is like an intuitive structure. So we did like pages of the product in terms of like where it was categorized. We were looking for what were pages of a website under certain mega menu headers. But basically, the long story short is like a card sort is called a card sort because you do it typically with physical cards. And so we did that early on, and that was like really fun and exciting. And users get to be really quick about rearranging these structures, and they can be really fluid, and it can be a really fun activity. And then we literally had to figure out how to make that happen digitally, and it was really weird. We basically originally did Excel with like with the cells itself being individual cards, and I remember we did that so many times that like the explainer of how to work this Excel sheet was like etched into my brain. I explained it, and I think I like we did pretty solid work with that, but I think what it says, like as another tip, is like now that we're all living in a digital UX world, digital research tools are so invaluable. I know we as a team use Optimal Workshop. That was a game changer, going from like screen sharing Excel to a program that is designed for card sorts where users have that flexibility and mobility. And then also like we using like digital whiteboards, like for UX research, but also like UX ideation. Like we originally used Miro and now we're using FigJam, but it's really on some level it's just like just having all these programs on some level are kind of comparable because they're just sort of like big whiteboards to draw on, but having something is critical.
I think definitely with the pandemic, it has forced these programs to evolve and these different softwares to evolve to make it easily accessible for remote UX research. Because at the time, you know, people were doing everything in person, and so there's less of, at least on our project, there's less of a need to have a virtual tool. But now, just with the way that the world is and moving forward, to your point, I don't see how you can have a UX team or be a remote team in general without some of these tools that lend itself to remote collaboration, whether it be for UX or even team building.
I was just thinking, like I know we're virtual and that's why we use Miro or FigJam, but I feel like I go back to the research a lot more frequently and more easily than I did if you did the whiteboard, the Affinity map, took a picture of it and go back to it. There's something about like, oh, well, that was said and done, and that's like time-stamped. Where, I mean, we go back into our FigJams. I was going back into the Miro for a branding thing for a long while. I don't know, because then you can work again right in there to refine it.
It's a living document.
Yeah, so I personally like it more. I don't know if maybe if we do ever go back in person or some hybrid form, well, I guess then we definitely always need a virtual tool. But even in person, I might recommend those.
I honestly agree with that.
I agree with that too. Just because, so the last couple sort of information or works. Working sessions, thank you, that we've done, that you two have led different ones on different parts of the site that we're enhancing. It's been awesome to just add a little sticky note as you guys are leading. I can be on there taking notes in real time right next to it. Like we get some feedback that's like this, don't like this, morph A and B together. It's super easy to just like have it right on screen. Everyone's on the same page. There's no secrecy in the sense of like, because it's a shared screen. Yeah. Everyone is seeing the sticky note. I'm not like it's not on like my notepad that I'm like writing notes down on or something. So I totally agree that no matter how this ends up shaking out and what things look like as, you know, people go back into in-person, having the virtual tool or having it up on a shared screen instead of a whiteboard, like having a digital whiteboard might be the
right? Like if we get like the smart boards in work, from like schools, so that you can like throw that tool up there and then still, because I do miss like the expo marker or actually touching stuff, but it'd be a cool, crazy hybrid world. Or maybe we all have VR sets on to mimic the in-person. But yeah,
I want an iPad so bad. Oh, sorry, you go.
no, I was just to say, like you said, the living document makes it more valuable than just a static whiteboard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then on the same sort of token of with this collaboration and getting feedback and various ways of doing that, what are some of our tips for building trust with participants, whether it be stakeholders, customers, anyone who's participating in the user research? How do you, like, what tips do we have that would be, because sometimes it can be awkward. Like sometimes you're just meeting this person for the first time and like literally they know that you're the UX interviewer or like you're doing something for the website, but they don't know any other context. And like, you only know them as this is their role at this organization.
It's really interesting to think about because moving to remote research, it's so different. In some ways, there's almost strengths to it because all of a sudden we have such increased access and it's so much easier to talk to people because they can be wherever. And almost at any time, there's not a pressure to do in person like we had done previously. But at the same time, especially on our project, you're doing these activities that are digital, and sometimes you have to meet people where they're at. Where like I feel like on our project, a lot of times the clients are people who are older, who are not necessarily like as immediately versed on like a lot of these like rapidly changing technologies. And so sometimes it's challenging because you're gonna have to meet people where they're at. And like, as a UX team, we are just using these tools every day that we're super versed in them, that like you are just throwing people, these links and saying, hey, can you just like use this Fig Jam board? And it's like, to us, it seems like so natural and easy. And then they're like, what is this? So I think it takes some time to like, just really taking the moment to like explain out when we're doing these kind of client activities or user activities, really explaining out like, hey, this is the tool that we're using and this is why we use it. And like, try to meet them where they're at before, just so like take them along the journey here before we just throw them into experiences where they're just like, what are these strange arcane devices that we're using?
So to make it a little saucy of a subject, maybe give a tip or trick about, so not all of our user research times or stakeholder times have been like peachy perfect. What are some like tips or tricks for when it's like going a little south? For whatever that reason is, right? Like we've had someone was getting really frustrated because the technology and they could only open up an IE and we needed Chrome. They were getting really frustrated and upset and we were just kind of there. And then there's been some other ones. So what would your advice be for bringing it back from the south? Yeah,
that is a spicy question.
I love this.
Sometimes I always think about it in terms of like advice you get with public speaking. You can say something, but it's got to like leave your mouth, enter their ear, and then they have to process it. Like I am someone who, when I just go, I feel like that has happened over the course of this conversation. I can just speak really quickly, and because I just love to hear myself talk. But like you gotta really, especially when you're throwing someone who maybe isn't even that well versed with technology, and then you are throwing things that would probably throw anybody for a loop, no matter how well versed they are. Especially, as you said, like some of these tools, it's like you got to be on the right browser and everything. That sometimes things just break. That just really keep it slow, step by step, and like in some ways it gets to be easier over time because once you've done the blurb a couple of times, you kind of figure out what like the internal speech is of these activities and explaining these tools. But I think sometimes it maybe just goes to like, I know it's very touchy-feely, but goes to the empathy aspect of UX, where just like you're trying to put yourself in their shoes anyway, because that's the job, and that's because you're trying to create figure out what this fact-finding mission is. But even in this moment, it's like, let's UX this activity itself. Let's figure out how to make their experience of whatever this interview or activity we're doing as smooth as possible, because when they're more comfortable and you feel like you're making that connection with somebody, and you're, making them feel relaxed, and like trying to make them laugh a little bit, and just make them feel comfortable, they're probably going to be like more honest, because they'll feel like, we had a UX activity where it was perceived that there was like we were asking questions about like a problem about this product that we were dealing with, and it was almost perceived that we were like somehow finagling office politics, and then people can really freeze up and people can get really upset, and it's like no, like I promise I'm just interested to be your therapist for an hour and listen to your problems. But you got to make people feel comfortable, and feel like that they can talk, and that this truly is just like a conversation that is no ulterior motive other than just trying to like understand a problem better.
Good job.
Yeah, yeah.
So that was really good.
So this is not a spicy question, but it might bring up some memories for you. So you've been our subject matter expert leading the charge with our research. With that comes data and insights that you pull then from the research. So do you want to share with us any insights or tips that people might find useful from, when we first went remote, you did everything by hand because we just didn't have the tools.
Digital tools that did it all.
Yeah. So do you have would you like to go down memory lane and share some insights on this?
8-hour days of those Excel charts.
Yeah, pulling
Absolutely.
numbers.
There are worse things that we've done. I remember user guides was the real thing.
Oh man.
As long as it's not user guides, that's fine. But yeah, so I guess like I feel like sometimes maybe there's been like people have gone back and forth on the concept of like the double diamond. I keep on hearing qualms, but we're gathering all this information, and then we have all this raw data that can be quantitative or qualitative. In the sense of like card sort data, it gives you like you have kind of like a direct results about like a certain thing was placed here, or there was a certain level of accuracy to a certain test. But then you have like an interview where people are just saying like sentiments, like they're saying sentences. This is like a motive concept, so don't lend itself to a kind of like a number-based analysis. So you have all these different types of data that you're trying to collate, trying to hone in on what exactly is the solution, or what exactly is the problem that we're trying to solve for. And it's tricky no matter what, honestly. I think about, it was a big thing is like we're talking about it in the context of remote, but even if we weren't remote, we would still have all of the same data. And the big thing is how do you analyze it? Because there's so many different ways you can do it with different sort of strengths and weaknesses. And the big thing was, especially when we had our qualitative data for card sorts, we had all this raw numbers essentially, and these like association Excel charts. And honestly, like analyzing data when it's not done automatically can just take a lot of time, and can be really tricky, as we just like talked about. Like we have limited time sometimes, and it's like, do we want to be spending that doing something that can be done instantly when we could be providing value as a UX team in other ways? So it's really great that we got like tools like Optimal Workshop, and it sounds like we're selling Optimal Workshop here. We're sponsored. Use our promo code. But we got that a lot of times because it was really helpful for remote activities, but also a lot of times these tools like that I just mentioned, like they can do instant analysis of certain data sets. And that just saves, it takes something that would have taken like, at least like, I don't know, a couple days of work or something. I did it by hand, like to zero. So like that in itself is a miracle. So honestly, I can never sing its praises enough. If you can, why work harder when you can work smarter, and also using a product that costs money. But if you can use those tools that do like an automatic data analysis, I mean, not only are you doing things quicker, but a lot of times with these programs, they can provide more models than you would be doing even if you were doing it by hand. Because when I was doing a lot of times these Excel sheets, I was really mostly just looking for percentages of association, I think really what it was. And Marie was really helpful for that because, you know, even I was so in the depths of it, and Marie had to come in and just like, let's call this down even simpler. And that was like a useful thing. But then, you know, a lot of these programs, they can do all kinds of crazy visualizations that sometimes you can get lost in, but it's really good to have multiple ways of visualizing information, because it can kind of, each kind of visualization has different strengths and weaknesses, and being able to showcase it in multiple ways kind of gives you a better sense of what a data set looks like in a way. But yeah, so it's been really helpful to have these digital tools. And even if we were to never be remote ever again, even though it seems unlikely, I would still want them so badly. And even we said, like, sometimes it's having these online data sources, like, or tools like, you know, Miro or FigJam. It's just a helpful thing to have as a repository for sure.
Yeah, I do want to go just as like a tip for our listeners, because we learned it. We did our user interviews before we got Optimal. We moved in because we were like, why take all these notes and then have to create all the sticky notes virtually? Do you want to talk about the learning curve that we used about how you should be taking notes in user interviews to make them better and more useful for when you go, like, we love affinity mapping, so that's one of our activities, but when you go to do anything with your sticky notes, what is a key tip on those sticky notes? Do you remember?
It's definitely because how I've done user interviews has changed over time for sure. Because when I first started doing it, I would almost basically just be trying to like record a whole transcript, and then I would like go through and then try to like highlight key points and turn those into insight statements. But the one thing that's really been interesting is that we've been using Untitled Workshop, and the way that they frame user interviews is, and for context, you know, you have someone who is facilitating an interview who is purely just engaged with the conversation and just like engaging with the user and not worrying about notes. And then you have somebody who's like recording it. But Optimal Workshop has this way that they want you to record their user interviews in their program, where it's basically just like sentences that you just like plug and it just chugs it into its system. But you have the ability to assign it to questions that you've preset as like basically one level of like a tag, and then you have like another level of tags you can kind of create on the fly. So it was a really weird transition going from just like loose note taking to a system where you're like trying to actively tag things on the fly. But honestly, the more I think about it, a kind of like a short snippet blurbs of insights that you're getting instead of like long form prose, and these insights being tagged and associated to questions was really helpful on the other end, because then a lot of times these programs will allow you to search through this data, and then you can be like putting in multiple tags, and you can very quickly like get to what specific genre of insights you're looking for. But I know, also I didn't talk that much about affinity mapping, but also I wasn't sure what sense you were thinking. I
was thinking more because Liz and I are usually on the note-taking side. That like our first time note-taking in Miro, Liz and I had like 3-word notes. And when we went to go affinity map, remember we were like, we had to like go back and listen to interviews. So Liz and I's note-taking skills and user research definitely and mature.
Yeah. And just as like a general, so affinity mapping is basically like, let's say you interview 5 people, just throwing it out there. Yeah. It's putting their big sentiments into what we're calling a sticky note, and then you group them together. So what usually ends up happening is a few of your users will say, I don't like XYZ, and then like, so then you group those together. Yeah. Then people will be like, I love this. So you group that together. And then, so basically you group the different sentiments together, and you put each user has a color. So like they could be like the yellow sticky note, the blue sticky note. You take all of those the notes that you take, you put the sentiments on their color sticky note. So then you're left with like, let's say 100 sticky notes from these 5 participants, or, you know, however many. And then you just literally like stick the sticky notes on the wall and group them together. Doing this digitally, we used Miro. Yeah. And when we first had started doing user interviews, like right when the pandemic hit, we were still taking notes on in like a Word doc. Yeah. So it was just, so we were literally like copying over like more, it was more transcript than blurbs. And then we were like, oh, you know, let's try just skipping the Word document sentiment and putting them directly on sticky notes. But to what Marie was saying was our sticky notes then, like, we were capturing what was being said, but it was very shorthand.
Yeah.
So then we did have to go back. And so that was definitely a learning curve that we will improve for next time.
Yes. Make sure you have some context. I think we even started putting the question at the top and grouping them, kind of what Optimal, you described in Optimal was happening. Yeah. Just from what we learned, that when you go back a week later, you're like, what? Yeah. What the heck were we doing at this moment?
It's interesting because I keep thinking about, because I imagine we're not the only UX teams that are like having these issues of learning as we're doing remote. Because I keep thinking about, like, one big thing was like the stickiness in Miro. We kept on losing track of who wrote what, because a lot of times there were very loose context. But then these programs keep changing. Because FigJam, in their UXing their UX tools, their sticky notes are labeled by who created them. I don't know. It's interesting. Like, I imagine, like, and I don't have enough knowledge to like really understand like what's necessarily happening in that field, but like I feel like the tools for digital UX work, or at least some of the digital whiteboarding, have like very quickly had to adapt and advance, because all of a sudden a lot more teams are trying to use it. Like, anyone thinking like, I get so many ads now for like digital whiteboarding tools that I have never heard of. And I keep thinking about, like, man, like I don't know. I mean, I'm sure we're not the only people who've like, we're doing Miro and now they're shifting to FigJam, just still trying to figure out like what is the best digital tool as these programs are like slowly developing, and some of them are kind of like taking a lead, so to speak.
Yeah, I totally agree with that sentiment.
Same.
So as we start to wrap up with you, well, first off, this has been really fun because you're on our project, so you know exactly like the like we work with you every day, so it's like kind of like fun to do this with you. But before I ask our last question, any other ones that you want to throw out?
Nope.
All right, cool. So Logan, do you have any tips for up and coming UX architects about user research? Any tips about getting into the field?
I guess I would phrase it this way, that it's always, and if I were to start any of these projects over again that I worked on, sometimes it's worth really doing your homework, in the sense that you learn as you go in terms of like what is UX best practice and how you really formulate things, but like really it's worth trying to stick to those UX fundamentals and like really being like, let's really formalize our research process. Let's try to keep the data as clean as we can, create problem statements, just try to keep everything as organized as possible. And it's hard because you really got to follow what is the limitations that you're working within. But really, in terms of like having really clear set personas, a really clear set problem statement can really help you in the future, because it can be a little more difficult and awkward to have to do it after the fact, which I feel like sometimes we've had to jump back and forth as like we've come with like more problems, and as we have like I have learned more about the field and become a better designer. But I think there's something to be said by like trying to keep that data as clean as possible, so when you move forward, it pays dividends in terms of you got to convince stakeholders sometimes, and sometimes those stakeholders are on your team. And so if you have that like robust data with you at all times, and you really have that like etched into the inside of your heart, it really allows you to overcome like obstacles of maybe development or obstacles of a client, because you have more information to back up whatever it is that you're trying to advocate for. And that doesn't necessarily mean that what your goal is, maybe it's not feasible, but at least you can really articulate your position as strongly as possible. Because sometimes I feel like there are these moments where I know in my gut that I'm right, but I don't necessarily have the data with me on hand to best advocate for it. So I think that's the big thing, is just trying to set yourself up for success, because as with any project, there are moments when you got to advocate your position, and like UX people, like you are the user advocate. So setting yourself up that you have all the data you need to be able to like really fulfill that role adequately.
Awesome.
That's a great tip.
Yeah, it's really great. So one more thing before you do our outro, we have a surprise for you, Liz.
Oh.
I just wanted to, I'll be back,
Oh.
send you off,
Oh, thanks.
because this is the last time we'll be together. So baby Nugget is here.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, guys.
Yeah.
I won't cry on screen. I'll cry afterwards. Thanks. Thank you. This is so nice. For people who don't listen, or for people who listen to the podcast, my wife and I are having a baby.
Yeah.
Thank you, guys. This is really nice. Thank you. I'm like a little flabbergasted right now.
Aww. So, do you want me to do the outro for the first time? All right. Well, this was Mock It. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share with your friends, and join us the next time. As always, if you're interested in learning more about how government and tech collide, visit metrostar.com and follow us on socials.